The greatest college football team ever. It seems like it's a question that will withstand till the end of time. A question that we keep asking ourselves every single year that there is a new national champion in college football. Who is the greatest team of all time in college football? And especially after this season, a new question has arisen between the 2020 Alabama National Championship winning football team and the 2019 LSU Tigers, who also won the national championship. Both teams won in very convincing fashions against very, very good teams, and both had some of the best offensive seasons that we have ever seen, probably ever in college football. The offensive football that is being played in college football right now is unlike anything that we have ever seen. And that has drawn the question to many, many people. Who is better, the 2020 Alabama football team or the 2019 LSU Tigers? A very, very good question, and a question that I want to break down for you today because I am very, very intrigued by this question. I think that both teams, first off, straight off the bat, I'm a huge fan of both of these teams. I was a big fan of Burrow on that LSU team. I was a big fan of everything that they did down there. Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, all of those guys. Great Delpit, Caleb Chase-on, Patrick Queen. Huge fan of all those guys. Same thing with this Alabama team. Devontae Smith, I absolutely love. One of my most favorite players in all of college football this season. Definitely a top three. One of my favorite college football players is John Mechie, wide receiver for Alabama. Now you may be wondering why is that? Because he is Canadian and I am also Canadian. Then you have, I love Mac Jones. I hope he's suiting up in the navy and orange next year for my Chicago Bears. You see the Khalil Mack jersey back there. I hope we get Mac Jones on the Bears next year. Najee Harris, the best running back in college football right now. I don't think ETN takes him over. I don't think Chuba takes him over. I don't think any other running back in college football is better than Najee Harris. Jalen Waddle, an amazing player. Patrick Surtain, one of the best DBs in college football. You got Josh Jobe. You got a ton of different guys on that Alabama team. So straight off the bat, this is not going to be biased. I'm a big fan of both of these teams. These are teams that I watched a ton of the last 2 seasons. So I know a lot about these two football teams. And I'm a big fan of both. So there's no bias here. My favorite football team, you see behind me, I got a Carolina jersey to my right and a Carolina jersey to my left. I'm a big Carolina Gamecocks fan. We have played both of these teams in opposite years, actually. We did not play Alabama this season, but we played LSU this season. And last season, we played Alabama, but did not play LSU. But still, nonetheless, I cover a lot of SEC football on this channel. So if you love SEC football, make sure to subscribe. So I've watched a ton of SEC football the past 2 seasons. I know these teams inside out. And I want to go through the stats and everything to compare these two teams who are very, very similar in offensive play styles. A team that had an absolutely huge air raid attack and also had a monster anchor in a running back and one of the best quarterbacks in all of college football for both teams, but also teams who had very, very sound defenses too. So let's get into, before I give you guys who I think should or would win this game, we got to look at the stat comparisons. 2019 LSU, 7.89 yards per play. Alabama, 8.31. Yards per game, LSU, 568.4 yards. And you got Alabama at 561.3 yards. So LSU takes that. Points per game, 48.4 for LSU and 48.5 for Alabama. 0.1 of a difference between the amount of points each team averaged per game. Alabama takes that by 0.1%. Another one that I think is really key, third down conversions. For LSU, 49.8%. Alabama put up a huge number, 61.9% of third down conversions for the Alabama Crimson Tide this season. Rushing yards, 166.8 for LSU, 168.3 for Alabama. As you can see here, these stats are so similar. You see, points per game was decided by a mere 0.1 point. You can't score 0.1 of a point in college football. You can't even score 1 point without kicking a PAT. That's the only way you can score 1 point in college football. The fact that these teams had such a similar points per game ratio or points per game average by 0.1% just shows you how even these teams are and how good, just how really similar these teams were. Now I want to go into something interesting. Position by position breakdown of who's by each room. So whether that's the wide receiver room, whether that's the QB room, whether that's the blah, 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 each position, who has the advantage and why. So we'll start off with the obvious one, quarterback, the big position. Am I taking Joe Burrow or am I taking Mac Jones? Mac Jones, amazing quarterback, one of the best deep ball passers in college football this season. Obviously, not a guy who's going to be all too mobile, but when he needs to move, he can. And he's just hitting targets. His accuracy was unbelievable this year. Joe Burrow, Heisman winner, one of the best deep ball passers I've ever seen in college football. Unbelievable there. Very mobile and knows how to escape when he has D tackles or D linemen on him. He knows how to make and create plays. One of the best players that college football has ever seen. I'm taking Joe Burrow for the quarterbacks. I think that Joe Burrow is the better player than Mac Jones. That's no hit to Mac Jones. I still think Mac Jones is an unbelievable player, but I would take Joe Burrow over Mac Jones for quarterback. Running back. This is a tough one because I'm a huge Clyde Edwards-Helaire fan. I'd say I'm a bigger Clyde Edwards-Helaire fan than I am a Najee Harris fan. But that being said, Najee Harris has put on an absolute talent show for Alabama the last couple of years. The plays, if you just look up his highlight reel, even though Clyde Edwards-Helaire, his highlight reel, unbelievable. Lots of amazing plays, lots of amazing runs that he has finished. But you see Najee Harris hurdling over guys, stiff-arming guys, constantly finishing plays, constantly, even though I am a bigger Clyde Edwards-Helaire fan. The better running back out of those two, I would take Najee Harris. So I have Joe Burrow and Najee Harris. Next, wide receiver position. And this is obviously the biggest and the juiciest out of all of them. You have Devontae Smith, you have Jalen Waddle, and you have John Mechie versus Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, and Terrace Marshall. Just right there. And then you could add tight ends. So you'd have Thaddeus Moss for LSU, and then you'd have, I'm pretty sure, Billingsley for Alabama. Just right there. The three wide receivers for each of these teams are all going to be first rounders at some point. We already know Justin Jefferson was. Devontae Smith is going to be somewhere. Jalen Waddle is going to be somewhere. Jamar Chase is going to go. That's another huge question. Who's going to go first in the draft, Jamar Chase or Devontae Smith this season? And then John Mechie, he's going to go somewhere in the draft. So right off the bat, I'm a bigger fan of the Alabama guys. But there's a huge but here. You have two Biletnikoff winners. You have a Heisman winner in Devontae Smith for Alabama. But you have a guy who's absolutely tearing it up in the NFL right now in Justin Jefferson. And Terrace Marshall is also going to be a first-round draft pick this year in the NFL draft. I honestly feel like, even though I love that Alabama receiving room right there, especially with the addition of Thaddeus Moss in there, I would take LSU's receiving corps in this scenario. You add in the 2019 Alabama wide receiver corps. I don't know how I'd be able to deny that. I don't know how I'd be able to pick that over LSU's, or how I would be able to pick LSU's over Alabama's 2019 wide receiver room, because you're adding Jerry Jeudy and Henry Ruggs to that, and that's four wide receivers right there. Although you had to kick out John Mechie, you have four first-round wide receivers right there versus LSU's three. So, but you take 2020 Alabama's receiving room, I do think that LSU's takes it, and it's by a slim margin, but I do think that LSU would have the better wide receiver room for this certain scenario. Offensive line, I think LSU won Offensive Line of the Year last year, and I think that Alabama won that this year, but Alabama's offensive line with guys like Alex Leatherwood and Landon Dickerson, that offensive line is really, really strong and really bullied the line each and every game this season, so I would take Alabama's offensive line in that scenario. Defensive line, I do think Alabama's defense did struggle at the beginning of the season. They struggled a lot in the secondary, especially in a game against Ole Miss. That was a real run-up on the scoreboard for a team in Ole Miss who does really rule the secondary. They really rule. Their receiving corps is amazing. Their offense is unbelievable with Matt Corral, Elijah Moore, Kenny Yeboah. You got Mingo. You got Snoop Connor. You got Jerron Ely. That offense is unbelievable. Defensive line-wise, I really liked LSU's last year. I think they got a ton of pressure on the quarterback. Alabama's, though, you got Christian Barmore, who's obviously one of the best defensive players in college football right now. I think I'm going to take LSU's here. It's really, really close. This is one that could go 50-50 either way for me, but I really think that I'd take LSU's in this situation. Linebackers, you got Dylan Moses, obviously being the key guy for Alabama, and then you got Patrick Queen, obviously being the main guy for LSU. I really think that Dylan Moses had an amazing season this season. I think that I would take Alabama's linebackers in this scenario. Alabama has had amazing linebackers constantly. They're able to produce them. And I think that Dylan Moses and this linebacker room this year was no exception to that. So I would take Alabama's linebackers in this scenario. And that brings us to the last one, defensive backs. Obviously, Alabama, Patrick Surtain, who's probably going to be the first DB off the board. You have Josh Jobe. You got tons of guys on that secondary. And then LSU, Grant Delpit, Derek Stingley. The list goes on and on and on for both of these teams. Derek Stingley, last season in 2019, Derek Stingley was the best defensive player in college football. It was either him or Chase Young. Those two guys were absolutely lighting it up on the defensive side of the ball. I think Derek Stingley had 7 or 8 interceptions last season in 2019. Unbelievable for him. And for that reason, Derek Stingley being probably the best defensive player in college football at the time, or the second best defensive player. And then Grant Delpit, he's producing at the NFL level. Grant Delpit is being an amazing player for LSU back in that 2019 season. I think that I'm taking LSU's secondary. It's tough. It's a really, really tough decision, but LSU's secondary was really, really good that season. So those are my comparisons to the rooms. But who would I take in an actual game? If we go a neutral site game, what team am I taking? I think there's something that a lot of people, when they're asked this question, has forgot. And that is, I know people are going to hate me for saying this. People are going to hate that I use this as an example. But I think that it is unfair and is just pointless that we played that 2019 Alabama versus LSU game if you're not going to use that in this consideration. If you're not going to use that game in this consideration, there was no point to the game, because the game, yes, LSU goes on to win the national championship after winning that game. They have an amazing season. They want to prove to themselves that they're one of the best teams in college football history, if not the best. And by that, you have to beat the best, and they beat one of the best in Alabama that season. If you're not going to factor this in, that LSU win against Alabama, where they had to go to Alabama, let's remember, full stadium, back when there were full stadiums, back when there were full capacity fans, LSU had to travel to Alabama for the big 3:30 LSU game in what was labeled as the biggest game of the decade. This game was lights out. The president was at this game. That's how big of a game it was. It was sold out, 100,000+ fans screaming and yelling. It was an unbelievable experience. That LSU team went into Alabama and came out with a win with an Alabama team that, let's not forget, had Tua Tagovailoa back then, had Jerry Jeudy back then, had Henry Ruggs, had Xavier McKinney. Who else did they have on that team? They had a ton of other guys on that team. Just a really, really, really... Jarek Wills, another big offensive lineman for Alabama. Tons and tons of added talent onto that Alabama team. And that 2019 LSU team was still able to go out there and win. And win playing a very convincing first half. Alabama did make the score a lot closer than the game actually went, in my opinion. LSU pretty much controlled it for majority of the game, but Alabama did make a late push to kind of make the score close, and the score, I'm pretty sure, finished at 46-41. If you would have, before that game, if I asked any of the Alabama fans out there, would you rather have in that LSU game, this is before you saw Mac Jones this season, if I went up to any Alabama fan the second before kickoff and said, I have the opportunity right now to change the quarterback for Alabama, would you rather have Tua Tagovailoa in, or would you rather have Mac Jones in? Everyone would have said Tua. Even though Tua was dealing with some kind of injury, everyone would have said Tua. I don't see anyone saying Mac because they didn't know what they had back then. So you can't say that, oh, Alabama had Tua back then instead of Mac Jones. You guys all would have taken Tua in that game. You guys all would have rather had Tua play that game against LSU because you felt like he gave you guys a better chance to win. So that just right there proves that, yes, Mac Jones was an amazing quarterback this season, but you had the 3rd or 5th overall pick in the NFL draft at quarterback. You had 2 other wide receivers going in the first round. You had an offensive lineman go in the first round. You had tons and tons and tons of talent to still be able to go out and beat that LSU team at home. That 2019 LSU team went on the road to Alabama and came out with a win in Tuscaloosa and just put the icing on the cake on what was an amazing season where they beat Clemson, they beat Georgia, they beat Oklahoma, they beat Alabama, they beat Texas. Let's not remember, they had to go to a packed stadium in Texas, 100,000+ fans, the big ESPN night game against Texas, who's the richest college football program in the country, one of the most premier programs. And they went in there and beat them. Even though Texas wouldn't be the greatest of teams last season, the atmosphere that they had to go up against in Texas was really impressive. Now, I also want to give some credit to this 2020 Alabama team, because you're hearing me say, oh, LSU had to deal with all the atmosphere. Alabama didn't have to deal with any of that. On the other hand, Alabama did have to deal with the COVID situation. Alabama had to constantly go through the COVID protocols, all that stuff. The uncertainty if they were going to play a game every weekend. You couldn't have any of the social stuff. You couldn't be with your teammates constantly. You had to be isolated in your room to make sure that you were safe enough to be able and healthy enough to play that game the next Saturday. Alabama had to go through much tougher things mentally and maybe even physically, considering COVID in that scenario. So you have the atmosphere side. LSU had to go through some crazy atmospheres. Alabama had to go through the COVID situation and everything. But all in all, if you match up these two teams back, you take the 2019, you go back 2 years, you take that, you time travel, take that 2019 LSU team right after they win the national championship, and you take this 2020 Alabama team, pluck that team right after they win the national championship, meet them up in a neutral site. So let's say the AT&T Stadium, so Jerry's World. You play them in the Cotton Bowl or whatever. Play those two teams right now. I would take the LSU team, even though it is very, very close. I do think LSU would have the slight edge in what would be an absolute offensive shootout. It would be an amazing game, an amazing coach game. Ed Orgeron versus Nick Saban. Nick Saban's the greatest coach in college football history, but I think just the talent-wise for LSU and what they proved to me from that 2019 season and the teams they beat and the fact that they already beat an Alabama team that already had so much talent on the road, I would take the LSU team here. So that is my video for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it. If you love college football as much as I do, definitely hit that subscribe button down below. Like the video, comment anything about college football, and thank you for watching, and come back next time.